what we see happening in America with the abolitionist movement is that many abolitionists advocates for equality for women. Now, and we see this happening. For example, just to give you an extreme example, John Brown. When John Brown was planning his adventure in Harper's Ferry, his plan to incite a huge slave rebellion, before he went on that trip, he wrote out a constitution, a proposed constitution for the free Africans that he planned to liberate. And in this constitution, it said that all people, not just men, but all men and women, people of all races would have equality. So that was a pretty radical idea. So John Brown would have been an advocate of equal rights for women. Sojourner Truth, who we just mentioned, not only was she actively involved in the abolitionist movement, but she also spoke to women's groups and was an advocate for equal rights for women as well. William Lloyd Garrison, who helped spearhead the abolitionist movement with his publication of The Liberator. William Lloyd Garrison believed in equality for women. Another example would be the Grimké sisters, Angelina and Sarah. Angelina and Sarah Grimké were from South Carolina. Their family owned slaves, but both girls, both young women, when they were young women, they converted to the Quaker faith, became determined that slavery was wrong, and both women, they moved to the North and became involved in the abolition movement, and both became but believed that women should have equal rights. So in addition to being advocates for equal rights for African Americans, they were advocates for equal rights for women. Angelina Grimké would go on to marry Theodore Weld, who was another abolitionist, very important in the abolitionist movement. When Oberlin College in Ohio was founded in the 1830s, it was founded as a college that would allow both women and African Americans to be admitted, and that was a radical notion, that to have a college where both women and men would be attending school and both whites and blacks would be attending school. And it so happened that the founder and the later president of Oberlin College was the great reformer and evangelist Charles Finney. So we see that there were tremendous connections and overlap between the people who were supporting equal rights for women and people who were abolitionists and wanted equal rights for African Americans. So why is this the case? Why was there this overlap? A lot of it had to do with the fact that women were the ones often involved in the abolitionist movement. As a result of the development of Victorian society, I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, as a result of the development of Victorian society, middle-class women oftentimes were very educated and well-read, but they could not enter into the professions. They couldn't become doctors. They couldn't become lawyers. They couldn't even vote, so they couldn't run for office. So many of the professions that were held by educated people, those professions were closed to women. So middle-class women often found an outlet for their intellectual interests by throwing themselves into the various reform movements. And it was believed that women were by nature more empathetic, more compassionate than men because of their activities as mothers and raising children. So it was believed that it was a natural fit that women should be involved in efforts to help the poor and the oppressed and the suffering. And since many people viewed the slaves as oppressed and suffering, many women threw themselves into the abolitionist movement and were very involved in the abolitionist movement. I mentioned a couple names already, Sojourner Truth and Angelina and Sarah Grimké. That's just to touch the surface. So now when women got involved in the abolitionist movement, they began to realize that in many cases, their status in society was not that different than the status of African Americans, of slaves. Women in the mid-19th century, by common law, women always had to have a legal guardian. Women could not buy property, they could not sell property, they could not enter into a contract without a permission from a male guardian. And the male guardian could be their father or their brother or a son, or basically their nearest male relative. Women could not go out and buy something or sell something or put it into a contract on their own authority, by themselves. They always had to have a guardian. So they were treated, basically as children under the law. And many women found this situation unacceptable. And many women who were involved in the abolitionist movement began to believe that women, just like African Americans, ought to have the same rights as white men. Now, in the abolitionist movement, the abolitionists were deeply divided. In 1840, the American Anti-Slavery Society had a big meeting. And they had this big meeting, and at this meeting, some of the women there were asking that they be put in positions of leadership, that they be allowed to be involved in the decision-making process. And William Lloyd Garrison, as a believer in equal rights, advocated that women be put in positions of leadership. Now, other folks there, like there was Catherine Beecher, who was the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was a writer and a big believer in this idea that women ought to be at home and raise children, and that women were compassion. It was often, historians refer to this as the cult of domesticity, that women had a special role to play as caregivers and as mothers and wives. Catherine Beecher, who was also an abolitionist, she disagreed with Garrison, and she took the position that women should accept a subservient position within the abolitionist movement. Now, eventually, there was a big breakup within the abolitionist movement, and Lewis and Arthur Tappan, who had been earlier supporters of Garrison, they left the movement and they went elsewhere. They continued to be abolitionists, but they disagreed with Garrison's position on the equality of women. So it was a very divisive issue. Now, after 1840, some women believed that the women needed to start their own movement and to push for equal rights for women. And two of these women who were very important, one of them was Lucretia Mott, and another one was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker from Philadelphia, from a wealthy family. Both her and her husband were intimately involved in the abolitionist movement, but she came to believe in equality for women. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was from New York. She had attended Troy Seminary, which was one of these more progressive schools for women. And she also believed in women's rights. And in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized a women's rights conference, the first of its kind. It met in New York State, called the Seneca Falls Conference. Now, it met in 1848. It was just a small gathering. But at this gathering, one of the results of this gathering was that it published a declaration of sentiments, a declaration of views. And this declaration was mainly drafted by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But it was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, just as Thomas Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence declaring independence for America. The declaration that came out of the Seneca Falls Convention asked for independence for women, It asked that all laws that denied women equal rights be eliminated, that women had equality with men, including the right to vote. Now, the Seneca Falls Convention was met with derision by much of the public, and they took on a lot of heat. But it also inspired a lot of women. And in the 1850s, there were a whole number of women's rights conventions across mainly the North, in Ohio and New York, and they also called for equal rights for women. Eventually, in the 1850s, Elizabeth Cady Stanton would be joined by a young woman named Susan B. Anthony. And Susan B. Anthony she was a young lady in the 1850s. She would work closely with Elizabeth Cady Stanton for a number of decades, all the way up until the very end of the 19th century. Trying to adjust the picture here. There we go. You can see Susan B. Anthony. In the image, you should be able to see a later picture taken of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony together that was taken when they were much older. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony worked for years. And it was, like I said, it was slow going. By 1860, through the efforts of the women's rights movement, they had succeeded in pushing for legislation in 12 states that they gave women, at least married women, the right to buy and sell property and to sign contracts without a male guardian. Now that might seem to the modern ear like not much of a requirement, not much of an accomplishment, but in terms of the opposition they faced from mainly men, this was a first step. Now it would be years and years of work until, it wouldn't be until 1920 in the 20th century that women would finally gain the right to vote. So by 1860, having in some states laws that allowed women at least to have some independence, to married women at least, to be able to sign contracts, that was a substantial accomplishment. One of the major reasons why the fight for women's rights was so slow and was so difficult was the prevailing cultural view that women's place was in the home, and that, in fact, critics of the women's rights movement in the 19th century often pointed out that women who were vocal, who spoke out, who gave speeches, that these women were unnatural, that they were too masculine, that they were not exhibiting feminine virtue. So there was great public pressure by society, social pressure on women to adhere to traditional roles. Now, the fact of the matter was that this idea of women staying at home was a new idea in the 19th century, because for as long as time immemorial, women had worked in factories, women had worked on the farm, and it was only in the middle class families where you had this cult of domesticity, where this ideal where women's place was to not work and to stay at home and raise children. That was basically a middle class phenomenon through most of the 19th century.